Newsnight talks to a man whose 3 sons are under arrest. Did they really plan to commit murder on an unimaginable scale? Tonight, a student leader, an expectant father, 3 converts to Islam and 18 others still in custody but none yet charged. One person was released without charge tonight. All but one of the rest can now be detained until next week. Could this man arrested in Pakistan be the mastermind? We reveal links between him and the Birmingham arrests. Anger and confusion at Friday prayers in the communities of the arrested.
I can clearly see that there'll be large numbers of Muslims coming out in the streets, numbers that we may never have seen before.
Cancellations and delays continue. The Transport Secretary tells us the critical alert could remain indefinitely. But remember Forest Gate and the innocent Brazilian. Do people trust the intelligence or the government? We'll be asking Andrew Gilligan. And a month on from the start of the war in Lebanon, we reflect on Beirut's lost summer. Good evening to viewers here and joining us live from across the Atlantic. The appearance of the names of the majority of the terror suspects on the Bank of England website announcing the fact their assets could be seized afforded journalists the opportunity to dig much deeper into their backgrounds. It also put their neighbourhoods under close scrutiny as family and friends emerged, some telling stories of recent religious fervour, others totally bewildered. Community leaders pleaded for the suspects to be judged innocent until proved guilty. In a moment we'll have the latest on the plot's apparent links to Pakistan. First tonight, Tim Hugh reports from the suspects' communities.
Friday prayers today at one of the main mosques in Walthamstow, East London, brought together a community both frightened and angry. Few believe the police were justified in arresting at least 13 local Muslims on suspicion of a conspiracy to commit mass murder, but almost all are worried about a possible anti-Islamic backlash. In the office of the youth club round the corner, they're running through the list of suspects whose assets have been frozen by the Bank of England. It's fallen to voluntary youth worker Hanif Kadir to organise advice and legal help for families who need it.
They're totally devastated. You know, they're lost, basically. They're lost for words, especially the ones that I've been dealing with. You know, they haven't got a clue how to handle it or what to do. You know, it's a total shock for them. And every minute and every hour, as it dawns upon them that, you know, what could happen to their young men, it's even more worrying. You know, one of the parents is actually being treated medically. She suffers from heart problems, and he's concerned about his children and his wife. You know. So it's pretty hard. Have we got your phone number?
Senior local police officers come to visit Hanif. He's checking the community's not being too disturbed by the media. But Muslim leaders here and elsewhere say they've not had nearly enough information or support from the police to deal with the aftermath of the raids. It's the same story in High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire, where at least 4 young Muslim men were arrested yesterday. Community leaders, police and councillors smiled for the cameras after a meeting that agreed all sides should avoid inflaming tensions. But one Muslim leader claimed police could have done much more to curb the growth of radicalism in the area.
These incidences are increasing. Without intelligence from the communities, it won't help the situation. If you put up the back of the communities and stick or blasé and say, we're not interested, we'll only come to you when we've got a problem, that's not sincere. And that's what we'd like to address. We want sincere policing.
Behind him, one of the addresses raided yesterday, home of one of the 3 converts to Islam, 2 of them from High Wycombe, who've been arrested in this operation. 19-year-old Don Stewart White married a Muslim woman recently and changed his name to Abdul Wahid. He's the half-brother of a leading model, Heather Stewart White, the former wife of French tennis star Yannick Noah, though it's reported they've never met. Here, neighbours know the convert mainly as a helpful young man who helped chop down trees and mow lawns. But no one expected him to become a pious Muslim.
It was a shock because one day I was walking down the street and he said Salaam Alaikum to me, and I came to a bit of shock. I just thought maybe it's a mistake. they said to me once again, and after I spoke to him, he had committed this land a couple of months back. All right.
Back in Walthamstow, the youth worker Hanif Kadirs organised a press conference for the family worst affected by yesterday's operation. All three of Fazal Hussein's sons were taken away by the police as terrorist suspects. Two are listed by the Bank of England: Umayya Hussein, aged 25, with a master's degree in computer studies, now looking for work, and his younger brother Nabil, 22, who also studied computing. Fazal came to England from Pakistani Kashmir 32 years ago. He worked in a shoe factory, though he's now unemployed. He says his three sons, the third, Mehran, is also a computer student, set off to pray at a mosque on Wednesday night and never returned. Then, at 2:30 next morning, the police arrived at the door. In his first extended interview, Fazal told Newsnight what happened next.
My wife fainted, and the police officers asked us to leave the premises. I asked about the children. They said, "I don't know. They'll come in the morning, promise." I asked, "Why did you come?" They said they've come to look for bombs and chemicals inside my house.
Only hours later, when he heard the news, he guessed his sons had been arrested. He says they were model citizens who raised money for the tsunami appeal and other charities.
The eldest son was looking for a job. They worked very hard, studied computers. If he studied and worked so hard, he was not going to do this kind of thing.
But here in East London, it's fair to ask whether Asian parents always know what their children are getting up to. There's often a huge cultural divide between one generation born in Pakistan and the next that's grown up here. In the youth centre that includes this gym, they're trying to channel young people's energies in a healthy direction and keep them away from radicalism. But youth leaders say it's sometimes a hard task. Everyone's waiting to see what happens to the men who've been arrested from this community. One's been released tonight, but there'll certainly be anger here if most of the rest are eventually charged.
Tim Hugh, well, today Pakistan said it had arrested a British citizen of Pakistani origin, an Al-Qaeda operative with links to Pakistan, along with another Briton and 5 other suspects. The Interior Minister said the arrest of one of the Britons, Rashid Rauf, had led to the wave of arrests in Britain. Our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, is here. Mark, you revealed this link to Pakistan last night. Now it's proving to be the biggest link so far.
Well, it is indeed. I mean, it was described yesterday by someone in the counter-terrorist community as a decisive factor in the timing of the arrests. The intelligence specifically coming from the ISI, Pakistani military intelligence. Now, today we've learnt quite a bit more about that. The Pakistani authorities themselves, of course, have announced publicly the arrest of this man, Rashid Rauf, who is British, from Britain. He holds British nationality. And tomorrow morning, a lot of the newspapers have got all sorts of colour and allegations. They're calling him the Talibrum and all this kind of thing. Now, on a more straightforward note, our own inquiries today have suggested that what actually got them interested at first in this man, the UK authorities, was transfers of money related to a charitable organisation that he was involved in, but which did not fit the normal patterns that one would expect in a charitable enterprise. They then alerted the Pakistani authorities, who stepped up their surveillance and started looking more closely at this man. And he is the brother of someone else who was arrested in the sweeps yesterday, who we also understand had some association with those charitable activities.
At the same time, there's actually quite a lot of information coming out of the United States, more than is coming out from any kind of formal channels in the United Kingdom.
Well, there is indeed. I mean, some of this information that's coming out and being attributed by American journalists to government or intelligence or homeland security officials in the US is the kind of thing which the British authorities find very, very difficult to deal with. I'll give you 2 examples. Firstly, a suggestion that the reason why the flights were pinpointed as belonging to the particular airlines, American, Continental, United and British Airways, going to the particular destinations was because the intelligence services were intercepting internet surfing by some of the suspects, and that they were planning routes using a flight search engine, and that this is what caused them to home in on these timings. Now, obviously, people today in the police and intelligence community in London are not wanting to say anything at all in comment about that kind of allegation, but it seems to have a ring of truth about it.
And just very briefly, also coming out of the United States yesterday and overnight was the fact that they thought there were going to be more arrests to be made, but there's an uncertainty about that as well. At the stage, what stage of the operation is that?
There seem to be mixed messages. On the one hand, a lot of officials saying we've got all the key suspects. On the other hand, in response to people asking, then why continue the critical state of alert, a suggestion some may still be at large.
Thank you for now, Mark. Well, I'm joined by Dr. Imran Waheed from the Muslim group Hizb ut-Tahrir, which Tony Blair last year promised to ban in the belief they glorified terrorism. It's since been allowed to continue. And Haris Rafiq, who established the Sufi Muslim Council in response to the rising levels of radical Islam. First of all, Dr. Waheed, what is it, do you think, that allegedly drives a British citizen to plan a terrorist attack which would kill random men, women and children, Muslims, non-Muslims, Jews, Christians, people of no religion?
Well, I think firstly we need to make it clear that when we consider what drives them, this is by no means a justification. We would condemn any attack on innocent civilians. But I think what's very clear, people who use political violence, usually there's a political grievance. And I believe that there is a political grievance, which is with the foreign policy of Western governments, whether that be the occupation of Iraq, the occupation of Afghanistan, the current attitude towards the Middle East crisis. I believe that this is a political grievance which causes anger, which causes some people to go... You consider this
to be a political attack rather than just an appalling act of violence that you consider, does that give it some justification?
No, not at all. I consider it to be an appalling act of violence.
So you condemn unreservedly, if this is the case, any attack on any airliner in pursuit of whatever aim?
Definitely. I would condemn that unreservedly. And what I would say is that if this alleged plot has been thwarted as an attack on innocent civilians, that is something that is very good. But at the same time, we have to realize at the same time the government is facilitating attacks on innocent civilians in Lebanon by allowing arms shipments to go to Israel via Britain.
But this is the kind of talk that you're promoting, and the kind of talk you're proselytizing among young Muslims as well. You understand that perhaps inflames the tension. Would you think that is the case?
I think, Kirsty, I'm a little concerned and I'm a little fed up of hearing the same old argument again and again. Yes, a lot of Muslims and non-Muslims are fed up with foreign policy. Yes, a lot of Muslim non-Muslims are fed up with housing problems. A lot of people are having the same problems and are fed up with political, foreign policy, etc. But not everybody's blowing themselves up. Not everybody is trying to kill innocent people. Why is it that some people, I really want to get to the bottom of why is it that some people are going down this route, and I think it's an ideology that we really need to face up to and try and confront head on.
But is that ideology connected to what you, Dr. Waheed, would say would be a legitimate aspiration, which, if I'm right, would to see Britain under Sharia law?
The issue is this. The issue is, if we're talking about an ideology, there are many movements which, for political reasons and political grievances, use violence. The Tamils, for example, we have seen historically. So the issue is not really an ideology. The issue here is
you're saying
really...
it doesn't justify it, but the question I'm asking you, you are, presumably you regard yourself as British and Muslim.
Yes.
British first, Muslim second, or whatever.
Okay.
But you regard yourself as possible to be both.
Correct.
You want to live in a Britain under Sharia law?
No, Hizb ut-Tahrir has advocated the return of an Islamic state in the Muslim world. It's never advocated the return of such a state here. But what I think needs to be very clear here, that the foreign policy issues and the anger that foreign policy has generated is very well known. It's known to the government, it's known to intelligence services. So we can't get away from this aspect of denial. We can't have Tony Blair always saying that there's a false grievance. We can't have George Bush describing this as Islamist fascism.
I just want to come in here. I certainly don't believe in all the foreign policies of the UK and many other countries myself, but I'm not going to go and blow myself up.
But why can't you counter what you would see is a radical version of Islam promoted by Dr. White? Why is it that you have failed, perhaps with second and generation Muslims who are following a different course? Why do they feel alienated?
I think there are many reasons why, but I think at the root cause, for example, I don't think having conferences where you can get 10,000 people and having a conference to decide whether you can be Muslim or British at the same time, and then concluding at the end of it that you can't be both Muslim and Britain really helps.
Well, this is Hizb ut-Tahrir.
Yeah, I mean, I actually went to the conference.
Okay, I think I need to pick up on this point here. We're not saying that people, because of these foreign policy concerns, should be engaged in violence. Rather, they need to be involved in political actions. They need to raise their voice against oppressive foreign policy.
But Imran,
so, for example, next week we're having a demonstration at the American Embassy, and we're encouraging people to join that.
But why do you think that Tony Blair thought that the aims of your organisation were such that he considered shutting it down?
Because in the Muslim world, we're working for an Islamic caliphate, and that is a threat to the dictators with whom Tony Blair has a very cordial relationship with.
Would it be better
so
if
it's
this
silencing political expression?
Kirsty, the problem is that when you start having a victim mentality, you breed anger. The minute you start building something from a negative perspective where you're the victim and you're focusing on hate, then you breed more anger. And I think that's the point that a lot of organisations are coming from, and that's what we need to tackle.
Do you think you need to celebrate the fact that you're Muslims living in Britain?
Of course. I don't see it as a dichotomy at all. I see myself 100% Muslim, 100% British as well.
Thank you both very much. Tomorrow's Times is publishing a letter accusing Tony Blair and his government's foreign policy of being in part responsible for fomenting extremism. The letter is signed by 38 Muslim organisations and 6 of the 8 Muslim parliamentarians. Well, earlier the Transport Secretary Douglas Alexander gave me his reaction to this. But first I asked him about the decision that the country remain on critical alert. At what point would that be ended?
The decision as to the national threat level is made by the Joint Terrorism Assessment Centre. It's not a decision made by ministers, it's an objective judgment as to the level of national threat. And of course that is a matter which is kept under review, but that's why I can't, or indeed no other minister, can give you any kind of timescale as to when the threat level is likely to change.
But if you are confident that you have got the main players and you're not looking for anyone else at the moment, why keep this level at critical?
If you speak to the Metropolitan Police, I've recently left the latest meeting of COBRA, the Emergency Response Committee of the government. The Metropolitan Police are very clear that this is an ongoing investigation, and indeed they describe the situation as being still the early stages of an ongoing and complex investigation. So frankly, there is no room for complacency.
So it is not necessarily true that you do have the main players?
Well, as I say, there is an ongoing investigation by the Metropolitan Police, but I stand by the remarks that my colleague John Reid made yesterday and indeed repeated again today, and notwithstanding the progress that has been made in the investigation, there is no room for complacency, and that's why the threat level reflects that.
Minister, the longer that no evidence is revealed, you may have evidence, but longer that no evidence revealed or charges brought, the less the trust will be, surely, in the police intelligence.
The nature of the threat that we do face is often complex, indeed often transnational. That's why these are inherently complex investigations. And I think people, not least in light of what has already emerged in the last 36 hours, need to respect the fact that the police are continuing their investigations. There are still people in custody, and it's rightfully the police who make decisions in terms of when that kind of information is released.
It is true, is it not, that Britain was never a target until we undertook the particular foreign policy we're pursuing, particularly in Iraq?
Well, frankly, I think that's nonsense. I think you have to remember when you make that claim that the attacks on 9/11 took place not just before Afghanistan, but also before the action that was taken in Iraq. Listen, I fully recognise that our policy in Iraq and indeed our policy in Afghanistan has divided opinion within the United Kingdom. It would be naive and disingenuous to pretend otherwise. But I don't think anything can justify the kind of terrorist action which we have and will continue to face as a country. If you look at the departure lounge in Heathrow Airport this evening, which regrettably is still filled with people seeking to get on board their planes and get moving once again, you'll see people of every faith, colour, creed and religion. The terrorist ambition is to divide the communities of the United Kingdom, and I believe the vast majority of the British people will stand united in their opposition to allowing that division to take place.
Of course, the attacks on 9/11 were before the war in Iraq, but of course the attacks on 9/11 attacks were directed at the US. I do repeat my question. There were no attacks on Britain before the war in Iraq, and I would ask you, do you think that since our involvement in Iraq, Britain is a less safe place?
Frankly, Kirsty, it would be disrespectful to the many British citizens who lost their lives in the Twin Towers not to acknowledge that that attack was not an attack directed solely at the United States. It was an attack directed, I would argue, at the whole international community. As I say, I fully appreciate that our policy on Iraq has divided opinion, both within my own party, the Labour Party, and indeed across the British public.
But has it made us less safe?
Absolutely nothing justifies terrorist action of the type that we are determined to continue to stop in this country.
Douglas Alexander. There's a growing sense that what the government and the intelligence services are saying and doing is not necessarily to be trusted, that we have been here before, that intelligence about terror plots have come and gone. That certainly seems to be the dominant view of many of the hundreds of our bloggers on the new Talk About Newsnight forum. In a moment we'll discuss this with Andrew Gilligan and Michael Gove. First, Michael Crick investigates why there is an atmosphere of scepticism.
A massive new security clampdown focused on Heathrow Airport. Hundreds of troops and police are sent in by Mr. Blair.
Just before the Iraq War, Heathrow is surrounded by armoured vehicles to thwart a terrorist attack. But many concluded it was just hype, and even the Home Secretary, David Blunkett, reportedly thought that police went too far. And who can forget that dossier?
It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons, that Saddam has continued to produce them.
A year ago, John Charles de Menezes was killed by police, who wrongly thought he was a terrorist.
The man was challenged and refused to obey police instructions.
Police are conducting an urgent search tonight for a chemical device. A man has been shot.
And then the raid in Forest Gate. 250 police, 2 arrests, but no charges of terrorism. All fuel for public distrust, not just among Muslims. Hence, many voices on the internet, including Newsnight's new forum, have questioned whether there really was a plot yesterday.
Here we go again. The media jumps unthinkingly to attention and reports as fact what remain allegations of terrorist plots from the police and security services.
It's all just propaganda to justify draconian laws.
Does anyone remember that Tony Blair came and told us, hand on his heart, that Iraq definitely had weapons of mass destruction? Well done, Tony.
How convenient for the government gets Lebanon and the terrorists, that is Israel, off the front pages.
And such skeptics also cite the coincidence of yesterday's action with the Home Secretary's strong warnings about terrorism only the day before. Warnings he repeated today when asked about distrust among Muslims.
I have made my answer absolutely plain in this. The threat from terrorism is a threat to take the life and limb of the people in this country in the most awful way, irrespective of what religion or what ethnic background they have. And the only response from the people of this country was to make common cause and common purpose against the terrorists.
But Home Office figures show rather more action than hard evidence. In the 4 years after September the 11th, 895 people were arrested here under the Terrorism Act. 138 were charged under the Act. 156 charged under other laws, including murder, GBH, use of firearms or explosives. But only 23 were convicted of terrorism offences, while almost 500, more than half those arrested, were released without charge. Most of the public may put up with mixed results, says this intelligence expert. It's among Muslims where distrust is more serious.
It's vitally important that the Asian community kept on side. I mean, they are the people, if you like, most involved in this, who have the most to lose in this whole subject for the next 20, 30 years, whatever. So they must be kept on side, and the police, I think, are doing their damnedest to keep them on side. I think the general public are less important. I think their fuse is longer. I think they understand that there's a 50% cock-up rate, and that sometimes that the police will get it wrong, sometimes they'll get it right.
From Lockerbie to July the 7th, there are good arguments why the police choose to be overzealous rather than overcautious. But thwarting terrorism also needs trust, and the authorities will be in big trouble if this week's threat proves to be exaggerated.
Michael Crick. Well, Andrew Gilligan now writes for the Evening Standard, and the Tory MP Michael Gove is the author of a new book on terrorism called Celsius 77. Andrew Gilligan, I suppose more you than any others would be sceptical about the level of this intelligence and whether or not the threat was imminent. But what do you think?
This is not Iraq. The threat is real, the threat is serious. The threat has not been fabricated by the government, unlike with Saddam Hussein. The question for me about
this week's raids is how real the threat was. Clearly something was going on. Clearly there was some kind of plotting going on. The question for me is, did it rise above the level of sort of internet fantasizing by young kids, the kind of thing that's actually sometimes in the past been overhyped as more serious than it is? Or, you know, I mean, we were told, for instance, on the day of the arrest that an attack was imminent, and we've seen reports today that it was due to take place within days. Now, if that's the case, why haven't they found any explosives?
Michael Gove, though, you heard Michael Crick saying that you'd rather, or one would rather the intelligence services were overzealous rather than overcautious. But in order for them to be overzealous, do they have had to have earned our trust in the past?
Yes, but I think that one of the criticisms you can level against the intelligence services in the past is that actually they've taken too softly a line with a number of suspects. If you look at people like Omar Bakri Mohammed or Abu Qatada or Abu Hamza in Finsbury Park Mosque, the intelligence services basically gave them free rein to recruit and train people, some of whom we now know were directly involved in terrorist activity. So if there is an overcompensation, then I'm glad that it's on the side of a greater degree of caution than we had before.
But you have to get the public on side, and the statistics there, Andrew Gilligan, that Michael Crick showed, that there's been a kind of, as it were, 50% cock-up rate. How long? I mean, if this proves not to be true, what happens then?
I think we have to give the police the benefit of the doubt on this at the moment. I do think they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't to some extent. But I think they need to improve their intelligence record. They need to improve their communication record. And I've been more impressed this time that they haven't been shooting their mouths off so much to the papers, which they did over the Forest Gate
but the
episode.
Ramping up of the political language, you know, death on an unimaginable scale.
That was highly emotive language, and I'm not sure that was well advised, to be honest.
I can understand why politicians, particularly government politicians at this time, feel the need to use that sort of language, because they've been under attack from people who've been cynical in the past, and naturally they're going to feel that they see intelligence, it signifies a real threat, and they want to underline the scale of it, and they feel vindicated. The other thing I was going to say about the statistics is there are two things that we need to bear in mind. One is that it will often be the case that there are people who are arrested and then released, but intelligence will have been gained as a result of that arrest, informers will have been recruited, and the other thing that's important as well is that sometimes you will have plausible intelligence that someone might be able to, or about to commit an act, but it is not enough necessarily, given the current state of our criminal law, to convict.
Yes, but to be absolutely fair to intelligence, isn't it also the case, Andrew Gilligan, that the intelligence services can score considerable hits that we will never hear about because of something that might happen 2 years down the line?
I think we'll hear about it, to be honest. I think they're desperate to show successes, and I think that's one of the reasons this week's episodes have been so heavily trailed and heavily publicised.
But is there not a case also that we are subjected to, for what the intelligence services might regard and the politicians might regard as perfectly good reasons, to disinformation at times, which is very counterproductive in terms of earning the trust, particularly of the Muslim community in this case?
That's one of the problems. I mean, clearly there has to be a policy, in an age of suicide bombers, there has to be a policy of shoot to kill on suspicion if you think somebody really is a suicide bomber. But not only do you have to get the right people, you then have to tell the truth about it if you get it wrong. And that's what they didn't do in the case of Jean-Charles de Menezes, and that's been tremendously damaging and a real black mark on that case.
And I think that while the public might say to the government, oh, well, you've ramped up the threat in the past, we're going to be cynical now, I wouldn't hold with that view, then I think it's also the case that the government will quite rightly feel that there are some people who are attempting to be cynical about this as part of a political agenda because they simply don't like the government's foreign policy or its security policy. And you'll find, not just within the Muslim community, but within the broader British community, there are some people who don't want to believe that there's a threat because they don't like Bush, don't like Blair, and don't like the way they've carried on.
There is an atmosphere of denial in some parts of the Muslim community, but nonetheless, the government has, if you like, fed that denial a bit by its lack of candour. I mean, the government has a very poor record of truth-telling on security matters. That's the problem. We've seen numerous plots, as Michael Crick said, which occupied huge amounts of media time and turned out in the end to be largely without substance.
Thank you. Well, coming up in the programme, we reflect on 30 days in which Beirut became known as war-torn Beirut once again. But first, a roundup of today's news. Our main story tonight: Pakistani authorities claim that there's an al-Qaeda connection to the alleged plot to blow up transatlantic planes. They've identified Rashid Rauf as a key suspect. The royal editor of the News of the World, Clive Goodman, has been suspended from his job at the paper. Police have charged him with intercepting voicemail messages left for members of the royal household. Another man, Glenn Mulcair from Sutton, has also been charged. Both will appear in court next Wednesday. The New England coach, Steve McLaren, has begun what he's called a new era in English football by dropping David Beckham. He was speaking at a news conference where he announced his squad for the friendly match against Greece next week. And the markets, the FTSE 100 index closed down, while in New York the Dow Jones also closed down. Against the euro, the pound was up, while against the dollar, the pound was down. The possibility of agreement on a revised US-French resolution which aims to end the fighting in Lebanon appears to be imminent tonight. Our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, is here again. What are the chances?
Well, the chances seem reasonably good in the sense that the Lebanese and Israeli governments have already said publicly tonight that they're minded to accept it. Condi Rice has said that she thinks it will be accepted by the government and that a vote will happen pretty soon. Broadly, what this resolution does is it starts off in the best diplomatic fashion, giving to one side then the other. So the terms of the ceasefire in which the Israelis are still allowed defensive operations are still there. That's possibly a source for friction in the future. But on the other hand, explicit in here is an Israeli withdrawal phased, which is of course what the Lebanese government wanted. I think there are two other points of note in the way this has all come out after these weeks of haggling. One is that although there's a talk in here of expanding the current United Nations force and giving it a more impressive or muscular mandate, there's none of this so-called Chapter 7 language about using force. And also some other issues to do with disarming Hezbollah are also finessed. In both cases, the mandate and the disarmament, there's a promise of further negotiations. Well, of course, from the Lebanese point of view, that makes it a good bargain.
Mark, thank you. Well, it's been a month since the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah began, a month in which many Beirutis had been looking forward to festivals, fun and freedom, as had, of course, the Israelis. Instead, the word Beirut is now once again preceded with the word war-torn, as it was throughout the 1980s. Robin Denslow has been in Lebanon for much of the conflict and reflects on the impact of the last month on life in that country.
Today, it seems almost impossible to believe. But until just 1 month ago, July the 12th, on the Hezbollah abduction of 2 Israeli soldiers, this is what Baalbek was famous for. The most magnificent Roman ruins in Lebanon, a major tourist attraction and the setting for one of the country's international summer festivals. The great Fairuz, the diva and cultural symbol of Lebanon, was to play here, along with the British